If someone had stood outside the tall glass windows of our Manhattan penthouse that evening, they would have believed they were looking at a perfect life. From 37 floors above the city, the skyline stretched endlessly, towers glowing like gold against the dark sky. The lights of New York shimmered across the Hudson like scattered diamonds. Inside, the apartment was warm, elegant, and silent in the way expensive places often are. The dining table beneath the crystal chandelier looked like a photograph from a luxury magazine. White plates arranged perfectly. Polished silverware aligned with mathematical precision. Fresh lilies stood in a crystal vase at the center, their scents soft and expensive. A bottle of red wine rested in a silver cooler beside the table. Everything was flawless. Everything looked like the life I had always imagined I would have. And yet, standing there in the kitchen, I already felt the quiet weight in my chest that had become so familiar. I had spent the entire afternoon cooking dinner. The recipe simmering on the stove had been passed down through Daniel's family for generations. Slow-braised beef stew, rich with herbs and red wine, cooked for hours until the meat fell apart under a fork. Margaret Whitmore had mentioned it once during a family dinner years ago, saying it was the kind of meal a real wife should know how to make. So I learned it. Not from her. From an old cookbook I tracked down online. I stirred the pot one last time before serving, tasting the sauce carefully. The flavor was deep and balanced, exactly the way the recipe described. The kind of dish that took patience and care. The kind of dish someone made when they wanted to show love. When Daniel finally walked into the dining room, he loosened his tie with one hand and scrolled through his phone with the other. His dark hair was slightly messy from the wind outside, and for a moment, seeing him there, I remembered the man I had once fallen in love with. Back then, he used to smile when he came home. Now he barely noticed I was in the room. "Dinner's ready," I said softly. He nodded without looking up. A few minutes later, Margaret arrived. My mother-in-law never entered a room quietly. Even the sound of her heels carried authority, sharp and precise against the marble floor. She wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, her silver hair styled neatly around a face that had aged beautifully but carried an expression that rarely softened. She sat down at the table and glanced around the room with the air of someone inspecting property she believed belonged to her. "Smells interesting," she said. I placed the stew carefully in front of them both. Margaret lifted her spoon slowly and examined the dish as though it were some kind of experiment. She tasted it. Her eyebrows rose slightly. Then she set the spoon down with controlled elegance. "Charming," she said coolly. The word lingered in the air for a moment. "Very rustic." Daniel chuckled quietly without lifting his eyes from his phone. Something inside my chest tightened, but I kept my smile in place. "I followed the recipe your grandmother used," I said gently. Margaret dabbed her lips with a napkin. "Well, perhaps she had more experience." Daniel finally tasted the stew. He nodded once. "It's fine. Fine." That was the entire review for 4 hours of work. I sat across from them and ate quietly while they discussed things that seemed to move in circles around me. Margaret talked about a charity gala she planned to attend next week. Daniel mentioned a dinner with some business contacts. Neither of them asked about my day. Neither of them asked anything at all. From the outside, we probably looked like a successful family enjoying a peaceful evening in one of the most expensive apartments in Manhattan. But inside the room, I felt invisible. For years I had convinced myself this was normal, that this was simply how powerful families behaved. Margaret always spoke about the Whitmore legacy with pride. According to her, their name had built half their world: investments, properties, connections, influence. The penthouse we lived in, the luxury car Daniel drove, the private memberships, the endless credit cards. All of it, she believed, came from the Whitmore fortune. And for years, I had let her believe it. Daniel believed it too. It had seemed kinder that way. After dinner, Margaret stood and smoothed her jacket. "Next time," she said casually, "perhaps something a little more refined." Then she walked toward the guest suite she occupied whenever she stayed with us. Daniel followed shortly after, still reading something on his phone. "Don't stay up too late," he muttered before disappearing down the hallway. The apartment slowly fell silent. I cleared the dishes alone. The sound of running water filled the kitchen while the city lights flickered outside the windows. The sink reflected the skyline like broken glass. I washed every plate carefully, dried them, and placed them back in the cabinet one by one. When the kitchen was finally clean, I turned off the lights above the stove and sat down at the island counter. For a long moment, I simply stared out at the city. 37 floors above Manhattan, everything looked peaceful. From this height, the noise disappeared. The traffic became silent lines of light. The chaos of millions of people living their complicated lives seemed distant. Up here, life looked perfect. But perfect was often just another word for carefully maintained illusion. My eyes drifted toward the marble counter beside me. There it was. Margaret's favorite possession. The black credit card. She had left it on the counter earlier while talking about a shopping trip she planned for tomorrow. The card had a smooth matte surface, heavy and sleek, embossed with the elegant silver logo of the bank. Margaret loved that card. She loved sliding it across counters in boutiques and restaurants, watching the way people's attitudes changed the moment they saw it. To her, the card was proof of the Whitmore family power. A symbol of wealth, of status, of authority. I reached out and picked it up. The metal felt cold in my hand. Margaret believed the card connected directly to the Whitmore fortune. She had no idea where the account actually led. Because the truth was simple. Every dollar connected to that card came from me. The penthouse, the memberships, the allowances, the lifestyle. For 5 years, I had quietly funded everything. Daniel had never asked where the money truly came from. His pride accepted the story Margaret preferred to tell, and I had allowed that story to exist. At first, it had felt like protecting him. Then it simply became easier. But sitting there in the quiet kitchen, holding the card between my fingers, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding. Why was I still protecting people who treated me like I didn't exist? Outside the window, a helicopter passed slowly across the skyline. Its lights flickered briefly against the glass. I turned the card over in my hand, watching the silver numbers reflect the kitchen lights. Margaret worshipped this card. She believed it represented her family's legacy. She believed it proved she still controlled the world around her. But in reality, the card connected directly to my account. My company. My money. My life. And suddenly, a quiet thought formed in my mind. Not angry. Not emotional. Just calm. Maybe it was time to stop paying for their illusion. The next morning, the world felt different. Not visibly different. Manhattan still woke the same way it always did. Taxis honking impatiently, commuters flooding sidewalks, steam rising from street grates like the city itself was breathing. The sky above the skyscrapers was pale gray, the kind of morning that made everything look colder and sharper. But inside me, something had shifted. At home, I was invisible. At work, I was someone else entirely. The elevator doors opened on the 32nd floor of Clark Financial Systems, and immediately the quiet power of the office surrounded me. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooked Midtown. Screens glowed across trading desks where analysts monitored markets moving across time zones. Conversations were calm, efficient, precise. Here, people stood when I walked into the room. Here, people listened. Here, I wasn't someone's wife. I was Adriana Clark, founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing fintech firms in the United States. A company that managed billions in automated trading infrastructure. A company I built from nothing. My assistant, Clara, greeted me the moment I stepped out of the elevator. "Good morning, Adriana," she said. "Tokyo closed strong overnight. The European markets are already reacting." "Any alerts?" I asked. "Just the usual volatility reports. I sent them to your dashboard." "Thank you." She nodded and returned to her desk while I walked into my office. My workspace was minimalist, almost quiet compared to the rest of the floor. A large desk of dark wood sat in the center of the room, facing a wall of monitors displaying real-time financial data. The city skyline filled the windows behind them. I set my bag down and powered up the main dashboard. Every morning began the same way. Review the systems. Check the automated trading performance. Analyze overnight movement. But before anything else, there was one habit I had developed over the past few years. A habit no one in my company knew about. I opened a secondary financial panel. A personal monitoring dashboard. It tracked a series of private accounts, properties, assets, investments, and a few personal expenditures. Most of the charts were predictable. Long-term investments moving slowly upward, property expenses fluctuating with maintenance cycles, corporate distributions from my company's profits. Then one graph caught my attention. Margaret's credit card. The spending line had jumped dramatically. I leaned forward slightly. What? The system expanded automatically when I tapped the graph. The numbers themselves weren't shocking. Margaret had always enjoyed luxury shopping, and the black card attached to my account had essentially no spending limit. What bothered me wasn't the amount. It was the pattern. The graph showed clusters of purchases repeating every week. Thursday, Thursday, Thursday. Each spike lined up precisely 7 days apart. I opened the transaction breakdown. The details filled the screen. Luxury restaurants, high-end boutiques, private cocktail lounges, designer stores, 5-star hotels. Every Thursday night, I stared at the timestamps. 9:12 p.m., 9:45 p.m., 10:30 p.m. My chest tightened slightly. Thursday nights. Daniel worked late every Thursday. At least, that's what he always said. Board meetings, client dinners, investment partners. His explanations had always sounded reasonable. For a moment, I told myself the same thing. Margaret had her own social life. She attended charity events, fashion shows, private gatherings with friends from her social circles. It wasn't impossible that the spending had nothing to do with Daniel. So, something about the pattern felt wrong. I clicked open the detailed logs and exported the last 6 months of transactions. Then I opened Daniel's shared calendar. We had synced our schedules years ago for convenience. The calendar showed meetings, business dinners, travel days. And every Thursday evening. Working late. Every single week. My fingers moved slowly across the keyboard. I aligned the two datasets side by side. Thursday. Luxury restaurant. Thursday. Boutique. Thursday. Cocktail lounge. Thursday. Private dining club. The times matched almost perfectly. My stomach tightened. I told myself I was overthinking. Patterns in data didn't always mean anything. Still, the analyst in me couldn't ignore the numbers. I began digging deeper. I opened location data attached to the credit card transactions. The map displayed itself instantly. A red dot appeared. Then another. Then another. All across Manhattan. But something else stood out. Several of the locations were restaurants Daniel had mentioned before. Places he said he went to with business partners. Places he claimed required private reservations. The air in my office felt suddenly colder. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Maybe Margaret simply used the card for her own outings. Maybe Daniel's dinners really were work-related. Maybe everything was still exactly the way I believed it was. My phone buzzed on the desk. The sound startled me slightly. A message notification appeared. The sender's name made me pause. Lena Carter. My old college roommate. We had studied economics together years ago before life took us in completely different directions. Lena had gone into journalism, eventually becoming an investigative reporter for one of the largest media outlets in the country. We spoke occasionally, but not often. I opened the message. Adriana. The pause in the text already made my chest tighten. I'm sorry, but you need to see this. Below the message was a photo attachment. For a second, I hesitated. Some instinct deep inside me told me opening it would change something. Then I tapped the screen. The image filled my phone. It was taken inside a luxury boutique. Bright lighting reflected off glass display cases filled with designer shoes and handbags. And sitting at the center of the store was Daniel. My husband leaned casually in a velvet chair, his arm wrapped comfortably around a young blonde woman sitting beside him. She couldn't have been older than 25. Her hair was long and glossy, her dress elegant but clearly new, something recently purchased. She smiled brightly while holding a pair of high-heeled shoes up to the mirror. But what made my breath stop wasn't the woman. It was the person sitting across from them. Margaret. My mother-in-law leaned forward proudly, her expression warm in a way I had rarely seen directed toward me. She looked almost delighted. In her hand was the black credit card. My card. The cashier stood beside them holding a shopping bag. Margaret extended the card with a satisfied smile, clearly enjoying the moment. Helping Daniel's mistress choose designer heels. For several seconds, I simply stared at the image. The office around me faded into silence. The sound of keyboards outside my glass walls disappeared. Even the city outside the windows seemed to stop moving. I zoomed in slightly. Daniel's arm around the woman's waist looked natural. Familiar. Comfortable. Not new. Not awkward. Not accidental. The photo had been taken from across the boutique, probably by someone pretending to browse nearby. Lena sent another message. One of my colleagues was covering a fashion event yesterday. He recognized Daniel. I didn't want you to find out from someone else. My hands felt strangely steady. There was no rush of emotion. No tears. No anger. Just a quiet, cold clarity spreading through my chest. I slowly set the phone down on my desk. Then I looked back at the financial dashboard on the screen. Thursday. 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 Luxury restaurants. Designer stores. Private lounges. Daniel's late meetings. Margaret's credit card. The pattern was undeniable. And suddenly, the numbers on the screen no longer looked like ordinary financial data. They looked like a timeline. A schedule. A routine. One that had been running quietly behind my back for months. Maybe longer. I leaned forward again, studying the graph carefully. For years I had protected Daniel's pride. For years I had allowed Margaret to believe her family controlled the wealth surrounding them. For years I had played the quiet wife who simply existed inside the life they thought belonged to them. But now the illusion had cracks. And once you see the cracks, you can't pretend the structure is still perfect. I picked up my phone again and looked at the photo one more time. Daniel laughing. The blonde woman smiling. Margaret proudly paying the bill. Using my money. For the first time that morning, my chest tightened. But it wasn't heartbreak. It was something else. Something calmer. Something sharper. Something far more dangerous. Because once the pattern was clear, it could also be corrected. I expected to cry. That was what people always said happened when betrayal arrived. Tears. Shaking hands. The sudden collapse of everything you believed about your life. I imagined myself breaking down, locking my office door, pressing my hands over my mouth while the truth shattered somewhere inside my chest. But none of that happened. Instead, something inside me froze. Not the kind of freezing that came from shock or fear. It was quieter than that. Colder. Like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep in my mind, turning off the part of me that had spent years trying to protect other people's feelings. I stared at the photo on my phone again. Daniel sat comfortably beside the blonde woman, his arm wrapped around her as if it belonged there. They looked natural together. Familiar. The kind of closeness that didn't appear overnight. And across from them sat Margaret. My mother-in-law leaned forward proudly, smiling as she handed over the black credit card. My card. The card connected directly to my accounts. For a long moment I said nothing, did nothing. I simply studied the image like it was a piece of evidence laid out on a courtroom table. Daniel wasn't just cheating. His mother was helping him do it. Encouraging it. Financing it. With my money. The realization moved through me slowly, like cold water spreading through my veins. They weren't hiding the affair. They were building a future around it. Margaret's smile in that photo was unmistakable. It wasn't the polite, distant expression she used when speaking to me. It was warm, proud, almost maternal. The way someone might look at the woman they hoped would someday become their daughter-in-law. My replacement. I leaned back slightly in my chair and let out a slow breath. The office around me continued moving normally. Phones rang on the trading floor. Analysts discussed market fluctuations through the glass walls. Somewhere in the distance, someone laughed at a conversation. Life continued. My life had simply changed direction. My eyes moved back to the main monitor on my desk. The financial dashboard was still open. And there, flashing quietly in the corner of the screen, was a new notification. Pending transaction. I clicked it. The details expanded across the display. $1,250. Luxury boutique. Pending authorization. My stomach didn't twist. My hands didn't shake. Instead, a strange calm settled over me. Somewhere across the city, Margaret was still shopping. Maybe with the blonde woman. Maybe alone. Maybe with Daniel standing beside them again, pretending this was normal. The pending transaction sat there patiently, waiting for approval. My mouse hovered over the authorization panel. One click could stop the charge. One click could decline the card. For a moment, I considered it. Then I leaned back again. No. That would be emotional. Messy. Reactive. And emotions had never built successful companies. Logic did. Structure did. Strategy did. I closed the transaction window. Then I opened a new tab. A blank digital notebook appeared on the screen. This wasn't something I usually used for personal matters. My notebooks were typically filled with business strategies, investment projections, corporate acquisition plans. But at that moment, this felt exactly like one of those situations. Because suddenly I understood something very clearly. This wasn't a marriage problem. Marriage problems involved arguments, miscommunication, feelings. This situation was simpler than that. This was a system failure. And systems had solutions. I reached into my drawer and pulled out a real notebook as well, a slim black leather one I often carried during meetings. The pen felt heavy in my hand. For several seconds, I simply stared at the blank page. Then I wrote 3 words. Project. 0 balance. The letters looked clean and deliberate against the paper. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just precise. I leaned back in my chair again and studied the words. The name fit perfectly. 0 balance. A term used in finance when an account is intentionally cleared out. When liabilities are removed. When inefficiencies are eliminated. Because that was what Daniel and Margaret had become. Liabilities. Failing assets. I tapped the pen gently against the notebook and began thinking the way I always did when analyzing a business problem. First step. Identify the system. Daniel believed he had wealth. Margaret believed the Whitmore family still controlled a fortune. Both of them believed their lifestyle was secure. The penthouse. The memberships. The credit cards. The cars. The monthly allowances. All of it. But the truth was something neither of them had ever bothered to verify. Every single dollar flowed from my accounts. Every expense. Every payment. Every subscription. 5 years ago, when Daniel and I married, I had quietly integrated his family's finances into a structure I controlled. At the time, it felt generous. Protective. Daniel had struggled early in his career, and Margaret had always insisted the Whitmore legacy should support him. So I allowed them to believe it did. Behind the scenes, I funded everything. I paid for the penthouse 2 years before the wedding. I paid Daniel a monthly salary through one of my holding companies. I funded Margaret's credit cards. Their luxury lifestyle had always been an illusion. One I maintained. One I protected. One they never questioned. But illusions were expensive. And suddenly, I no longer felt responsible for maintaining it. I opened the financial control panel again. The system displayed every linked account clearly. Penthouse utilities, vehicle leases, country club membership, private concierge service, Margaret's black credit card, Daniel's expense account, and several smaller luxury subscriptions they probably forgot even existed. Each one connected neatly to my financial structure. Each one easily adjustable or removable. The pen moved across the notebook again. I began writing a list. Phase 1. Observation. Continue monitoring transactions. Document spending patterns. Confirm routine. Phase 2. Containment. Restrict non-essential financial access. Limit discretionary spending channels. Reduce liquidity. Phase 3. Correction. Remove financial dependencies. Terminate unauthorized beneficiaries. Restore asset control. I paused. The words sounded cold, clinical, almost ruthless, but they also sounded logical, because this situation had never been about money. It had been about respect. For years, I had allowed Daniel and Margaret to treat me like someone who existed on the edges of their lives. Someone who cooked dinner. Someone who smiled politely. Someone who didn't need recognition. But the truth had always been sitting quietly behind the scenes. I had built the life they were living, and they had just used it to humiliate me. My phone buzzed again on the desk. Lena. Another message appeared. Are you okay? I stared at the screen for a moment. Then I typed a reply. Yes. A few seconds passed. Another message appeared. Do you want me to delete the photo? I looked at the image again. Daniel laughing. The blonde woman leaning against him. Margaret proudly holding the credit card. My card. The symbol of their imaginary power. I typed again. No. Keep it. Because evidence was valuable. Especially when correcting a system failure. I set the phone down and turned back toward the monitors. Outside my office windows, Manhattan stretched endlessly in every direction. Millions of people moving through their complicated lives. Millions of stories unfolding quietly behind closed doors. But inside my office, the situation had become simple. For years, I had been the quiet wife. The polite daughter-in-law. The invisible support system behind their comfortable life. But that version of me no longer existed. Because once you understand the true structure of a system, you also understand how easily it can collapse. My eyes moved once more to the financial dashboard. The pending boutique charge still sat there, waiting patiently for authorization. I clicked approve. Let them enjoy their purchases. Let them believe everything was still normal. Because the most effective corrections were never rushed. They were planned, calculated, precise. And now that I finally understood the pattern, I could begin dismantling it, piece by piece. That afternoon, Margaret and Daniel's mistress were still shopping. The boutique sat on one of the most expensive streets in Manhattan, the kind of place where the windows were cleaner than mirrors and every handbag cost more than a month's rent for most people in the city. Inside, soft music played quietly while the scent of expensive perfume floated through the air. Margaret loved places like this. Stores where sales assistants greeted her by name. Stores where champagne appeared without being asked. Stores where the black card in her purse turned every request into an immediate yes. Across the city, I watched the transaction feed appear in real time on my financial dashboard. Another purchase attempt had just registered. Luxury boutique, $3,840, pending authorization. I leaned back in my chair and imagined the scene unfolding. Margaret sat comfortably on one of the velvet chairs inside the boutique, her posture straight and confident. The blonde woman beside her, Daniel's mistress, was likely laughing, holding up a pair of glittering designer heels in front of the mirror. The kind of heels someone bought when they believed the future was already secured. Champagne flutes probably rested on a glass table between them. Margaret would be smiling proudly, offering opinions the way she always did, playing the role of a generous future mother-in-law. "Those are lovely on you," she might say. "Yes, those will do nicely." I tapped the screen and opened the transaction log. 3 separate charges appeared. Shoes. A handbag. 2 silk dresses. Total purchase, nearly $4,000. My mouse hovered calmly over the card settings. 5 years ago, I had built the financial structure connecting Margaret's card to my accounts. At the time, it had seemed easier than constantly transferring money manually. The card had no spending limit. But it did have one small detail Margaret never knew about. Administrative override access. Which meant every charge still passed through my system before final settlement. I opened the control panel. The option sat quietly on the screen. Card status. Active. Below it was a simple switch. Suspend. My finger rested on the mouse for a moment. Not out of hesitation. Out of precision. This wasn't about revenge. It was about timing. Because the first correction in any broken system needed to be visible, memorable, educational. And suddenly the transaction alert updated. Purchase attempt. Processing. Perfect. That meant the cashier had just inserted the card. I clicked. Suspend card. The system confirmed the change instantly. Status. Declined. Authorization blocked. I closed the dashboard and folded my hands on the desk. Across the city, the scene unfolded exactly as expected. Margaret placed the black card onto the glass counter with a smug smile. The cashier, a young woman wearing elegant black gloves, picked it up carefully and inserted it into the card reader. The machine beeped. A short, sharp sound. Then the screen flashed. Transaction declined. Margaret blinked. She gave a small laugh, the kind wealthy people often used when they assumed technology was simply malfunctioning. "Try again," she said casually. The cashier nodded politely and inserted the card again. The machine processed for a moment. Then, beep. Declined. The blonde woman beside Margaret frowned slightly. "That's strange," she said. Margaret waved a dismissive hand. "Sometimes these systems are unreliable." Her voice still carried confidence, but there was a slight edge of irritation now. "Go ahead and try again." The cashier inserted the card a third time. The boutique had grown quieter. Nearby customers glanced over curiously. Everyone in places like this recognized the black card. It was a symbol of unlimited purchasing power. Seeing it fail even once was unusual. The machine processed again. Then the answer appeared. Declined. Margaret's smile stiffened. "That's ridiculous," she muttered. She pulled the card back from the cashier and examined it briefly as if the metal itself had betrayed her. Then she reached into her purse again. "Use this one." She handed over another card. The cashier swiped it. Processing. Then the same response appeared. Declined. Now the blonde woman shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret, maybe we should." "No," Margaret snapped softly. "Just a moment." She pulled out another card. Declined. Another. Declined. The boutique had gone completely silent now. Even the soft music seemed to fade behind the tension in the room. Customers browsing the displays had stopped pretending not to watch. A few people exchanged curious glances. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who loved displaying wealth like a crown, stood frozen in front of the counter while every card she owned failed one after another. Color slowly rose across her face. Red. bright, humiliating. The cashier looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said carefully. "The system is declining all payment methods." Margaret's voice dropped into a sharp whisper. "That's impossible." But the screen still displayed the same message. Declined. The blonde woman quietly placed the designer heels back onto the counter. "I think maybe we should come back later," she said. Margaret grabbed her purse tightly. "Yes, perhaps the bank systems are temporarily down." Her voice had lost the effortless confidence it carried earlier. She turned and walked quickly toward the boutique exit. But humiliation moved faster than footsteps. The whispers had already begun. Across the city, my phone began ringing. "Margaret." I let it ring twice. 3 times. Then I answered. "Hello." Her voice exploded through the speaker. "What did you do to the cards?" I leaned back in my chair and glanced out the window toward the Manhattan skyline. "Oh," I said slowly, letting a note of confusion enter my voice. "That's strange." Her breathing was sharp. "Don't play games with me, Adriana. None of my cards are working." I pretended to yawn softly. "Maybe it's a system error." "A system error?" she snapped. "Yes," I replied calmly. "Banks have outages sometimes." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice tight with anger. "You need to call the bank immediately and fix this." I looked at the financial dashboard glowing quietly on my monitor. Every card connected to Margaret's accounts now displayed the same status. Suspended. "Of course," I said gently. "I'll look into it." Then I ended the call. The silence in my office felt peaceful. For the first time all day, I allowed myself a small smile. Not because Margaret had been embarrassed. Not because the blonde woman had been forced to put her expensive shoes back on the shelf. But because the system had responded exactly as expected. The first strike had landed perfectly. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just precise. And most importantly, educational. Because somewhere in Manhattan at that exact moment, Margaret Whitmore was learning something she had never imagined before. The power she believed she held had never belonged to her at all. Declined. Margaret's smile stiffened. "That's ridiculous," she muttered. She pulled the card back from the cashier and examined it briefly as if the metal itself had betrayed her. Then she reached into her purse again. "Use this one." She handed over another card. The cashier swiped it. Processing. Then the same response appeared. Declined. Now the blonde woman shifted uncomfortably. "Margaret, maybe we should." "No," Margaret snapped softly. "Just a moment." She pulled out another card. Declined. Another. Declined. The boutique had gone completely silent now. Even the soft music seemed to fade behind the tension in the room. Customers browsing the displays had stopped pretending not to watch. A few people exchanged curious glances. Margaret Whitmore, the woman who loved displaying wealth like a crown, stood frozen in front of the counter while every card she owned failed one after another. Color slowly rose across her face. Red. Bright. Humiliating. The cashier looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said carefully. "The system is declining all payment methods." Margaret's voice dropped into a sharp whisper. "That's impossible." But the screen still displayed the same message. Declined. The blonde woman quietly placed the designer heels back onto the counter. "I think maybe we should come back later," she said. Margaret grabbed her purse tightly. "Yes, perhaps the bank systems are temporarily down." Her voice had lost the effortless confidence it carried earlier. She turned and walked quickly toward the boutique exit. But humiliation moved faster than footsteps. The whispers had already begun. Across the city, my phone began ringing. "Margaret." I let it ring twice. 3 times. Then I answered. "Hello." Her voice exploded through the speaker. What did you do to the cards? I leaned back in my chair and glanced out the window toward the Manhattan skyline. Oh, I said slowly, letting a note of confusion enter my voice. That's strange. Her breathing was sharp. Don't play games with me, Adriana. None of my cards are working. I pretended to yawn softly. Maybe it's a system error. A system error? She snapped. Yes, I replied calmly. Banks have outages sometimes. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice tight with anger. You need to call the bank immediately and fix this. I looked at the financial dashboard glowing quietly on my monitor. Every card connected to Margaret's accounts now displayed the same status. Suspended. Of course, I said gently. I'll look into it. Then I ended the call. The silence in my office felt peaceful. For the first time all day, I allowed myself a small smile. Not because Margaret had been embarrassed. Not because the blonde woman had been forced to put her expensive shoes back on the shelf. But because the system had responded exactly as expected. The first strike had landed perfectly. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just precise. And most importantly, educational. Because somewhere in Manhattan at that exact moment, Margaret Whitmore was learning something she had never imagined before. The power she believed she held had never belonged to her at all. Over the next 48 hours, I quietly dismantled their lifestyle. There were no dramatic confrontations. No shouting matches. No emotional scenes. I didn't storm through the penthouse demanding answers, and I didn't accuse Daniel of anything. Instead, I did what I did best. I adjusted the system. The first change happened that same evening. The private car service Daniel used almost every day had been on a premium corporate subscription under one of my holding accounts. 4 years, a sleek black sedan arrived whenever he requested it. Airport trips, dinners, business meetings, weekends in the Hamptons. Daniel never wondered who actually paid for it. He simply believed the Whitmore name carried that kind of privilege. At 6:30 p.m., I logged into the service dashboard and selected Cancel Subscription. The confirmation message appeared. Your premium account has been terminated. Simple. Clean. Final. The next adjustment followed shortly after. Margaret loved the country club more than almost anything else. It was where she spent her afternoons playing tennis, attending charity luncheons, and reminding people that the Whitmore family still belonged among Manhattan's old social circles. Her membership was one of the most expensive in the city. But the monthly fee came directly from my account. I opened the billing panel. Membership renewal. Pending. I clicked Remove Payment Method. Then I closed the page. That membership would quietly bounce the next time they tried to charge it. No drama. Just silence. The third correction happened the next morning. Every week, a luxury grocery delivery service arrived at the penthouse. Organic produce, imported cheeses, premium meats, specialty wine, everything Margaret insisted on having available at all times. Daniel never noticed the cost. Why would he? He had never paid for it. I opened the delivery subscription. Recurring order, Thursday delivery. I selected Cancel Service. The screen blinked once. Subscription terminated. One by one, the small luxuries began disappearing. Quietly. Almost invisibly. That afternoon I reviewed the final adjustment. Daniel's salary. 4 years, Daniel believed he worked as a consultant connected to one of my company's partner firms. A monthly payment of $15,000 arrived in his account like clockwork. He called it income. He told his friends he was involved in investment strategy. Margaret proudly told people her son had important financial responsibilities. But the truth had always been simpler. It was an allowance. From me. 5 years ago, I created the payment structure to protect his pride. Daniel had struggled with his career after college, and I knew how sensitive he was about money. So I built a quiet system that made him feel successful. The monthly deposit came from one of my private financial subsidiaries. Technically legitimate, but entirely under my control. I opened the payroll management system. Daniel Whitmore's name appeared neatly in the list. Monthly disbursement, $15,000. Next scheduled payment, tomorrow. My finger rested briefly on the keyboard. Then I selected Remove Recipient. The system asked for confirmation. This action will permanently terminate the disbursement. I clicked Confirm. Just like that, Daniel Whitmore stopped being a salaried man. Across the city, the dominoes began falling. The first reaction came that evening. Daniel walked into the penthouse kitchen with his phone in his hand and confusion on his face. "Did the car service cancel my ride today?" he asked. I looked up from the book I was reading on the couch. "Oh." I tried requesting a driver after work, and the app says my account is inactive. I tilted my head slightly. "That's strange." Daniel frowned at the screen. "Maybe it's a billing issue." "Probably," I said calmly. He shrugged and walked toward the bedroom. For now, the inconvenience seemed small enough that he ignored it. The second reaction happened the next morning. Margaret returned from the country club earlier than usual. The moment she entered the penthouse, I could tell something had gone wrong. Her expression was tight with anger. "They suspended my membership," she said sharply. Daniel looked up from the breakfast table. "What?" "They claimed the payment method failed." Daniel frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Margaret glanced toward me briefly, but only for a moment. The possibility that I might control the payments never crossed her mind. "I'll call the club later," she muttered. "Must be some banking error." I sipped my coffee quietly. The system was working exactly as planned. That afternoon the grocery delivery didn't arrive. Margaret noticed immediately. "Where are the groceries?" she demanded. Daniel checked the kitchen. The refrigerator door opened slowly, then closed again. "Maybe they're late," he said. But the delivery never came. That evening Daniel opened his banking app. I watched the moment his expression changed. He refreshed the screen once. Then again. Then again. "Did you get paid today?" Margaret asked casually. Daniel stared at the phone. "No." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean, no?" "The deposit didn't come through." Margaret shook her head. "That's impossible." Daniel refreshed the screen again. Still nothing. "Maybe the transfer is delayed," he muttered. But the delay continued. Hours passed. Then the entire evening. The penthouse began to feel different. 4 years, wealth had filled every corner of the space. The marble counters, the imported furniture, the endless services that appeared whenever they were needed. Now something invisible had shifted. The refrigerator slowly emptied. The internet connection quietly downgraded when the premium subscription expired. The concierge services stopped answering Daniel's requests. Luxury didn't vanish all at once. It faded, piece by piece, like lights slowly going out in a large building. The tension inside the penthouse grew heavier with every hour. Margaret called the bank repeatedly. Daniel contacted his company. No one could explain the missing money. Because there was nothing to explain. The system had simply stopped. Late that night, Daniel stood in the living room staring out the window at the city lights below. "Something's wrong," he said quietly. Margaret paced behind him. "This will be fixed tomorrow," she insisted. But her voice carried less confidence than before. I watched them from the kitchen island. Calm. Silent. Observing. Because panic followed a predictable pattern. First confusion. Then denial. Then fear. And they were only at the beginning. The penthouse still looked beautiful. The skyline still glittered outside the windows. But the foundation supporting their comfortable life had already disappeared. They just didn't realize it yet. And the most fascinating part was watching them slowly discover the truth. Because the wealth they believed they owned had never belonged to them at all. Eventually, they confronted me. The tension inside the penthouse had been building for 2 full days. Small inconveniences had turned into serious problems. Calls had gone unanswered. Payments had failed. Services that once appeared instantly now ignored Daniel's requests entirely. Luxury had disappeared quietly, but its absence had become impossible to ignore. By the 3rd evening, Daniel finally decided something had to be done. I returned home just after sunset. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse living room, as they always did. The moment I stepped out, I saw them waiting. Daniel stood near the large glass windows overlooking the skyline, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Margaret sat stiffly on the sofa, her posture rigid, her expression colder than usual. They looked like prosecutors waiting for a defendant. Neither of them greeted me. The room was silent except for the low hum of the city far below. I set my bag down calmly on the marble table near the entrance. "We need to talk," Daniel said. His voice was sharp, controlled. But underneath it, I heard something else. Uncertainty. I walked toward the living room slowly and took a seat in one of the chairs across from them. Margaret wasted no time. "This situation has gone far enough," she said coldly. Her voice carried the authority she always used when she believed she was addressing someone beneath her. "The cards have stopped working. The club has suspended my membership. Daniel's payments haven't arrived. The car service account has been terminated." She leaned forward slightly. "You need to explain what you've done." Daniel spoke next. "Just fix it," he said flatly. His tone carried irritation, but also a strange confidence, as if he still believed the problem was temporary. "Call the bank," he continued. "Restore the accounts. Whatever this little stunt is, it's gone on long enough." For a moment, I simply looked at them. 4 years, I had imagined what this conversation might feel like if it ever happened. I thought there might be anger, or sadness. But instead, I felt something far calmer. Clarity. "I didn't sabotage anything," I said quietly. Margaret scoffed. "Don't insult us, Adriana. None of these things fail at the same time by accident." Daniel nodded. "So just undo it." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick envelope. Then I placed it gently on the coffee table between us. The sound of the paper sliding across the glass surface echoed softly in the room. Daniel frowned. "What is this?" "Evidence," I replied. Margaret's expression tightened. "Evidence of what?" "Open it." Daniel hesitated for a moment, then reached forward and pulled several photographs from the envelope. The first image showed Daniel sitting inside the boutique. His arm wrapped around the blonde woman. Margaret sitting across from them. The black credit card clearly visible in her hand. Daniel's face went pale instantly. His fingers froze around the photograph. Margaret leaned forward and grabbed another image. More photos. Different angles. Daniel walking into a luxury hotel with the same woman. Daniel and the woman sitting in a restaurant booth. Margaret joining them at a private lounge. Then came the documents. Hotel receipts. Reservation confirmations. Security stills taken from lobby cameras. Margaret's lips tightened into a thin line. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. Daniel stared silently at the photos, his breathing growing heavier. "These are fake," Margaret continued sharply. "Fabricated." I reached calmly into the envelope again. "There's more." I placed another document on the table. Margaret snatched it up. Her eyes moved across the page quickly. Then she frowned. "What is this supposed to be?" "The deed to this penthouse," I said. Daniel looked up. Margaret's voice turned sharp. "And?" I pointed to the name printed on the document. "Adriana Clark." Margaret read it again. Slowly. The room fell silent. "That's impossible," she said finally. "Is it?" I asked. Daniel grabbed the paper from her hands. This says the property was purchased. His voice trailed off. 2 years before our wedding.
Yes.
He stared at me. You bought this apartment?
Yes.
Margaret shook her head immediately.
No.
The Whitmore family has owned this property for decades. I slid another paper across the table. Then you should read the city property records. Margaret didn't move. Daniel did. He scanned the document. The official seal at the bottom left little room for argument. Margaret's confidence faltered slightly. That doesn't explain the accounts, she said. I reached into the envelope again. This time I placed a thicker document onto the table. Daniel picked it up cautiously.
What is this?
Your employment records.
My employment records?
He repeated.
Yes.
He flipped through the pages slowly. The confusion on his face deepened with every line. This says I'm listed under corporate payroll.
Yes. As what?
I waited until he reached the line himself. Then his voice stopped completely. Margaret leaned over his shoulder.
What does it say?
Daniel swallowed. His voice came out quieter than before. Dependent, spousal support. Margaret blinked.
What?
He read the line again. A monthly disbursement, $15,000. Margaret snatched the papers from him.
This is absurd.
But the records were clear. 5 years of payments. Each deposit traced back to one of my financial subsidiaries. Daniel looked at me slowly.
You paid me?
It wasn't a salary, I said calmly.
It was an allowance.
Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages.
For 5 years,
she whispered.
Yes.
Silence filled the room.
Heavy.
Unavoidable. Daniel looked around the penthouse as if seeing it for the first time. The marble floors. The skyline. The furniture. Everything he believed represented the Whitmore legacy. Everything he thought his family owned. I don't understand, he said quietly. I folded my hands in my lap.
It's simple.
Neither of them spoke. So I finished the sentence.
I built this life.
The illusion shattered without a sound. No shouting. No dramatic scene. Just silence. The kind of silence that arrives when a lie collapses under the weight of truth. For the first time since I had known them, Margaret Whitmore had nothing to say.
And Daniel
finally understood something he had never questioned before. Everything he believed he owned had always belonged to me. The next morning, I summoned Daniel to my company headquarters. I sent the message shortly after sunrise. No explanation. No argument. Just a time and an address. Be here at 9:30 a.m. For years Daniel had told people he worked with my firm. That was the version of the story he preferred to repeat at dinners and networking events. In his mind, he had always imagined himself as a quiet partner behind the scenes of something important. But the truth was much simpler. He had never been inside the company. Not once. When the glass doors of Clark Financial Systems opened that morning, Daniel stepped into a world he thought he understood. But the illusion began breaking the moment he entered the lobby. The building itself carried a quiet authority. Marble floors reflected the soft overhead lighting, and the reception desk sat beneath a large brushed metal logo mounted on the wall. Clark Financial Systems. 2 security guards stood near the elevators. Analysts moved quickly through the lobby with laptops tucked under their arms. Conversations about markets and investments floated through the air. Daniel walked toward the reception desk slowly, as if he suddenly wasn't sure he belonged there. I'm here to see Adriana Clark, he said. The receptionist smiled politely. Of course, Mr. Whitmore. She's expecting you. She pressed a button beneath the desk. Within seconds, a young assistant approached. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Please follow me. Daniel nodded and walked behind her. They entered the elevator. 32 floors passed in silence. When the doors opened, The entire trading floor stretched out before him. Dozens of monitors displayed financial charts and market movements. Employees spoke in calm, focused voices while analyzing data. Daniel looked around with growing confusion. "Where's Adriana's office?" he asked. "This way," the assistant replied. They walked past rows of analysts and glass-walled conference rooms until they reached the far end of the floor. A large office stood there. The assistant stopped outside the door. "You can go in." Daniel hesitated for a moment. Then he pushed the door open. I was already sitting behind my desk. The morning sunlight poured through the tall windows behind me, illuminating the skyline of Manhattan. The office was quiet compared to the trading floor outside. Daniel stepped inside slowly, and then he saw the nameplate on the desk. Adriana Clark, founder and CEO. For several seconds he didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the metal plate. Then he looked at me. "You own the company?"
"Yes."
His confusion deepened. "I thought you were just part of the executive team."
"I am," I said calmly. "But I'm also the founder."
Daniel looked around the office again. The framed awards on the wall. The financial publications featuring my company. The charts displayed on the monitors. The scale of the operation suddenly became real. His voice dropped. "You never told me. You never asked." He opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. Finally, he sat down across from my desk. For the first time since I had known him, Daniel looked unsure of himself. I folded my hands calmly on the desk. "This meeting won't take long," I said. He nodded slowly. "I'm listening." I opened a folder beside me. "Your allowance has been cancelled." Daniel stiffened. "It wasn't an allowance." "Yes, it was." I slid the payroll records across the desk. "You received $15,000 every month for 5 years. The funds came from my company's subsidiary accounts." Daniel stared at the papers. Then he looked up. "You could have just talked to me. I tried talking to you for years." He didn't respond. So I continued. "Your mother's credit cards have been permanently terminated." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "She's been calling the bank non-stop." "They can't fix it." "Why?" "Because the accounts belong to me." The room grew quieter. I slid another document across the desk. "The penthouse also belongs to me." Daniel glanced at the deed briefly. Then he leaned back in the chair. "So that's it?" he asked. "No." I reached into the folder again. Then I placed the final document in front of him. "Divorce papers." The words sat clearly at the top of the page. Daniel stared at them. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I explained calmly. "You have 2 options." He looked up slowly. "You can sign the papers today and leave peacefully." His eyes moved back to the documents. "Or," I continued, "you can fight the divorce in court." Daniel's jaw tightened. "And if I do?" "You lose." He leaned forward slightly. "You sound very confident." "I am." I tapped the folder lightly. "The prenup you signed 5 years ago protects every asset I own before the marriage." Daniel's expression darkened. "I don't remember signing that." "You didn't read it." The silence stretched between us. Outside the office, the trading floor continued moving normally. Analysts discussed markets, keyboards clicked, phones rang. Inside the room, Daniel's world was collapsing quietly. "You planned this," he said finally. "No." "Then why now?" I met his eyes. "Because you stopped pretending to respect me." The truth landed harder than any accusation. Daniel looked down at the divorce papers again. His fingers hovered above the page. But he didn't sign. Instead, he stood up. "I need time. You don't have much." He turned toward the door. Then he paused. "What happens if I don't sign?" "Reality," I said simply. Daniel left the office without another word. For a brief moment I watched him walk across the trading floor through the glass wall. He looked smaller somehow, lost, as if he had just stepped into a world he no longer understood. But reality caught him quickly. Within days, the consequences spread through his life. The blonde woman who had happily shopped with Margaret disappeared the moment she realized Daniel's money had vanished. His calls went unanswered. The dinners stopped. The expensive gifts ended. And suddenly the relationship wasn't interesting anymore. His friends faded away just as quickly. Without wealth, Daniel Whitmore became a man with very little to offer the circles he once moved through. Rumors began spreading. Then facts followed. Financial records surfaced. Property ownership documents circulated. Within a week, the story everyone had believed about the Whitmore family collapsed. The legendary wealth, the powerful connections, the social prestige, all of it turned out to be smoke built on someone else's money. Mine. Meanwhile, my life grew quieter. For the first time in years, the penthouse felt peaceful. No tension. No criticism. No invisible expectations. Just silence. I stood by the window one evening, looking out across the Manhattan skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. For a long time, I had believed revenge meant destroying the people who hurt you. But that wasn't true. Revenge was much simpler than that. It was simply the moment you stopped protecting the people who were using you. And once I stopped, everything collapsed on its own. Their wealth, their reputation, their illusion. The Whitmore empire didn't fall because I attacked it. It fell because it had never been real in the first place.